all of you some really different concepts than you've maybe heard before. As Charlie said, I'm a speech pathologist, and I practiced about 18 years before returning back to school for my doctorate. So my experience is really broad in terms of neurogenic communication disorders. And a lot of the things that I want to bring to you today are things that I've really worked on through patient care and working with my patients and helping them to come to a place of some adjustment of what they're currently struggling with. And in some cases it's been MS or Parkinson's. In some cases it has been voice disorders. So we've been listening a lot to a lot of concepts about understanding the core pathophysiologic correlates and neural correlates of SD. And certainly, this has been such a rich day of information and a workshop that I'm coming away with great concepts. But if we were to just leave it at that and just talk about the physical changes that our bodies sometimes go through over our lifetime, we would probably be leaving out a huge piece. In rehabilitation medicine, one of the big shifts and increased foci that we have is in not only addressing the physical differences and manifestations that we see of a given condition, but also really understanding that those physical changes really relate to significant forms of psychological distress and social distress. And so very often we begin with the physical changes, but we absolutely must move to psychological and social and other levels of change. So that's by way of backdrop for what you're about to kind of start discussing with me. I view this as a conversation, so while I may do a lot of talking, I do want to hear from you, and I'll solicit that on occasion. One of the concepts, and it's in the title here, in terms of identity, what is an identity? That is a concept that in our digital age has really become a lot more prolific. People talk about identity theft. Anybody here ever heard or seen the television commercial of a 40-something-year-old man? I think this is Citibank. And he is sitting in a chair, popping a can of beer, having himself a nice kickback, watching some bowling, I believe it is. And on comes the audio for his speech, and the audio is this young 20-something girl who's talking really fast like this. I'm like, oh my gosh, I just had a shopping spree and it was only like $1,500. And she goes on to talk about her indiscretions and her shopping, and his identity has been stolen. And the concept that this is a personal invasion, and this is personally an affront to who I am, that my core sense of who I am in my own head was just usurped by this other female voice. And that's not a terrible analogy for what it is that patients can go through when they're fairly suddenly, oftentimes, confronted with a change in their voice. So we're going to talk about identity theft and how that can be a framework for what we want to talk about and how to improve our own sense of adjustment. I'm going to give you some concepts that actually come from within the realm of medical anthropology. We're going to start talking first about the process of having that diagnosis and receiving, if you will, that diagnosis. And we're going to talk about how that can be a double-edged sword, essentially. And then we're going to also move to some concepts within what it means to have a chronic condition and how that impacts us. What does society say about how we should do illness and how we should do having a chronic condition? And then move into 3 different potential alternative approaches of how we can frame having a condition such as SD. And I might add, this could be applied to other conditions. And then help you to sort of begin the process with a little, I wouldn't be, I guess, a faculty teacher if I didn't give you homework. So we'll give you a little bit of homework to start considering for yourself, how do I frame my own experience with this condition? And how can I frame it in a way that not only helps me improve potentially the physical manifestations, but recognize that when I also address the psychological distress that I have, that I can indeed improve both at the same time. And I'll explain more what that means. So first off, with the diagnosis, I have a particular interest in sort of dissecting the words that we use in the medical realm, and diagnosis is certainly one of them. And I'm going to give you some definitions for what they really mean. Diagnosis is different and is distinguished by a very famous medical anthropologist whose name is Arthur Kleinman. He comes out of Harvard, and he's actually a psychiatrist, but we borrow a lot from his work. And he was the first to distinguish for us what's the difference between illness and disease. And how does that relate to diagnosis? Illness is what we perceive as a distress or a discomfort. And so this is a personal phenomena associated with the disease category, and these may or may not have a corresponding disease. So I may feel fatigue, but not have disease. I may feel a headache or nausea, but not have a disease process. And we contrast that with what the disease is, which is that biomedically defined category. And so these two things are distinct. And Kleinman argues that our perception of illness doesn't necessarily just have to be physical. It can be a distress that really relates to how I interact with this disease. And he distinguishes that further, as does the guy by the name of Paul Rule, with the sick role. And we're going to come back to these concepts throughout these next few minutes. But what is the sick role? A role is a societally constructed way of doing something. We take on a role. I take on the role of teacher right now. You take on the role of attendee, student. Sometimes we take on the role of patient, and sometimes we take on the role of sick. And you all know just as much as I do that people with SD are not sick. We don't perceive ourselves as sick, are we? But yet we go to a doctor and we enter the medical realm. And so because of that very fact, there are a number of societal expectations about how we do sick that we are suddenly confronted with. One of which we'll talk about right away, which is when you enter the sick realm, if that is the role one takes on, we are required to take on an adherent or compliant role. And in medicine, we talk about the patient who is compliant. Everybody here have reflux precautions? Somebody here does? For reflux that affects our voices, we have to be adherent or compliant with that. So on the one hand, we have to be in a patient role, which we think of as sort of a recipient passive role. And yet, on the other hand, society says that we're supposed to take an active role in our recovery, which is why you're here. So there can be this, to some extent, double bind. Let's first talk about the diagnostic process. And there's a concept that I think you're going to walk away with today. Hopefully you have your senses heightened to how we talk about it. Diagnostic process just begins with a physician recognizing first your humanity and your experience, and then relating your complaints to a predetermined set of symptoms that correspond to an illness or disease. And this process brings that physician to being able to name a disease. When we name that disease or illness, we now can inform our treatment plan. This has its real big benefits. I don't know how many of you suffered for a while before realizing that this isn't just an occasional little voice break. This is a thing. And when I say that thing word, I talk about that labeling process when we've isolated that thing as different from ourselves. Now, what we've done is we've done something called nominalization. And so what is nominalization? So again, I'm going to give you a little grammar lesson. Who all remembers diagramming sentences? Okay, you remember what suffixes are, right? So what happens when we nominalize a process? And nominalization is something that we do all the time in medical talk. We have medical talk, we have legal talk, we have school talk, we have all kinds of talk. And in medicine, we nominalize. And it takes something that I have experienced, which is usually a verb, and it turns it into a noun. So endings like I-O-N or A-T-I-O-N. So now I can say, my blood circulates, but no, we don't say that. We say what?
Circulation.
Yeah, so now circulation is something that you actually have. It gives it thingness. So when you first received that diagnosis, You went from the process of experiencing something that was sort of transient. You didn't see it, hear it. You could hear it, but you couldn't see it. It felt sort of esoteric. It disappeared. It wasn't predictable. It changed constantly. And now you had a thing that you now have, and it gave it some solidity. It gave it some permanence. It gave it some constancy. And now you entered into the process of having this label, this diagnosis. So what are the effects of that? I talked about the thingness and solidity that that gave to you, and this can be a really hope-lending, positive thing for people to finally say, oh, now I know what this has been. This is SD. The grammatical effect is that now, however, we often have removed the pronoun. Here's back to grammar lesson. We also take away agency because you no longer circulate. Your blood has circulation, and it's apart from your personal pronouns. In the case I gave an example with MS or multiple sclerosis, the way we talk about disease is now no longer multiple sclerosis as an action, but now we talk about multiple sclerosis causes these things. Multiple sclerosis causes changes in vision. It causes changes in walking. But is multiple sclerosis a person? No. Somehow in our language, we've given it agency. We've given it power, and now it's a noun. And this is, maybe I'm seeming to be overly specific about a very fine grammatical feature, but when you add that up over the course of years and weeks, the psychological effect of how we talk about this can be pretty powerful. So those are some positive ways that diagnosis can indeed affect us psychologically, give us a sense of thingness. How can possibly receiving this diagnosis potentially hurt us? And by that I mean that from a psychological point of view. Certainly within the realm of SD, we have a diagnosis that itself relates to communication. So when a communication disorder, and I want you to begin to also, if you have not already, thought about it this way, SD is not just a voice disorder. We view it as a communication disorder. So it produces a social problem, doesn't it? I don't really want to go to that party. It's going to be loud. I'm tired. It's been an exhausting day. I just want to stay home. That's a social issue that we now have. But these problems are subject, so our problems are subject to social actions. I change my response to that. I might reduce my life participation. I might reduce my initiation in those social contexts. And guess what that does to my sense of who I am and my identity? Well, our identity theory tells us that our identity is really tied up in not just how I think of myself, but in also the feedback that I get from those social experiences. So identity construction is first and foremost a socially mediated process. It's reciprocal. Someone says to me, hey Laura, you are so adventurous. You do triathlons. You run. You are such an adventurous person. I receive that information. I take that in, and then I look for confirmations, and guess what I also do? I confirm that with my later behavioral response. So one of the interests that I have in voice, and it's really coming through in the literature as well in voice and in other communication disorders, is that we need to be also honing in on our patients and clients continuing to participate in life, because that is not only the source of enjoyment in life, but that's also a place where we reconfirm and obtain our sense of identity. And I think this slide is just kind of confirming for us here that communication itself, when I talk to another person, a family member, a friend, I am engaging in this conversation. And not only that, but my voice is to some degree kind of a fingerprint for myself. When I answer the phone, my family member says, hi, who is this? And they know automatically how I'm feeling. Oh, you sound down, or you sound tired. Or you sound a little bit stressed, what's going on? And I've maybe said what? Hello. That's it. Okay, that's reminding me of a current pop tune. Therefore, the question of how to reformulate or reconceive our identity and its usual vehicle, our voices, is really a unique and pretty perplexing one. So let's talk a little bit more about our name, what's in a name. Because we talked about the process of nominalization, and now as you listen to yourselves speak and physicians speak and other people speak, I want you to be continuing to listen for places where we have turned our actions into nouns. That's one application. But let's talk about what's in a name. First of all, so how do we define who we are? Am I Laura? What makes me Laura? I guess what makes me Laura is my physical body. But I think we all know intuitively that it's going beyond my physical body that I draw my identity of who I am from. Just by way of background, the word name itself comes from the Greek etymon, or the true sense of a word. And so I think what we're looking for in all of our life journeys is to continue to retain and reconfirm who our true identity is, what our true identity is, and not allow identity thieves like SD to take that away from us. And it is a particularly challenging thing when we have a chronic condition that changes throughout the day, throughout the week. A little bit about identity. It's an odd kind of esoteric concept to think about for a moment here. But the concept, again, of identity is really, really growing in its focus in neurogenic communication disorders. Partly because communication, when it's affected, directly impacts our sense of who we are. So Taylor said that who we are and where we are coming from is a very simple way of defining identity. It's who I am and it's where I'm coming from. So you can get the sense that in identity there's a lot of sense of history. I have a background, this is where I'm coming from. What's the first thing when you meet someone for the first time, and I've met a number of people today, what's one of the first things you ask?
Where did you come?
Where'd you come from? Where do you hail from? What city? What town? And what's the other one?
What's your name?
What's your name? And one more. What do you do? Exactly. So name, where you come from, and what do you do? So the what we are about is another part of identity. And again, keep the app running in the background here when I discussed that social engagement is how we develop and reconfirm our sense of identity. It's defined by dialogue with others, and one of the things that Erickson in 1968 noted was that when we go about this process of identity over our lives, we're looking for consistency. And so when we have something that interrupts a consistent identity and surprises us, like the guy who the voiceover with the 20-something-year-old, it interrupts our sense of continuity and it sort of shakes our feeling of who am I? Guess what we have to do then? We have to renegotiate that identity. And the particular difficulty with SD is, again, because it's late onset, oftentimes somewhat sudden, and it changes. So the concept that I have to continually adjust over the course of the day is just, it's ever present. So after diagnosis, this is especially critical in the advent of a new diagnosis. It's a social process, and we manage this identity process mostly with our close friends and family, but we also manage it with broader social circles. And so here's just a picture of some of the ways that, some of the levels of identity formulation and how it can be impacted. In the inner circle here, we're really focused on that voice. This is levels of communication, and whenever any of these levels of communication are interrupted, our sense of identity can be more or less threatened. So we can have interruptions in language, and my patients with stroke have an interruption in identity due to stroke. We can have an interruption in our cognition, or even just the formulation of ideas. So we're focused on that inner circle. I want to circle back to the sick role idea. So you talk with your spouse, you talk with your family, you talk with your close friends, and they give you feedback of what you're like. Laura, you're really adventurous. You like to do crazy things. But it's also socially modulated. And this is a picture of someone on a train in Japan. And in some parts of the world, there are different expectations about what we're supposed to do when we have any physical difference. Whether it's a cane or a walker or something more invisible. Like in this case, this young woman could have very easily gotten on that train and never done a thing, but it's expected socially that she would wear a mask. So that's a responsibility. So when you think about sick roles, we have certain responsibilities and certain rights. So I want us to talk for a brief moment, maybe turn to a partner for 30 seconds. And I want you to think about the last time that you had an illness, maybe it was just a cold or a flu, can be something relatively benign, and ask yourself, what were the expectations that those around you had of how you would behave? And I'll get you started with one or two ideas. When you're really, really sick as a dog, you pick up the phone and you do what? If you're working full time, you call in sick. And so this is something that our society, according to Paul Rule and others in social medical anthropology, say is socially accepted, and we have a structure in place to allow for that. Okay, so turn to your partner, someone next to you, and just talk about one of the things that was expected of you when you were sick the last time. What were things that you were expected to do in the world in that volunteer. What's an expectation that was put on you when you were sick the last time? Go ahead and just holler out. You're supposed to take medication, so you're supposed to do something for yourself. Okay, what's another expectation? Rest. You're supposed to not engage in usual life activities. Extra hand hygiene. But you made a very good point, because one of the things that we're expected to do is show to the world that we are being personally responsible with the condition that we're now faced with. So you hit on a couple of things. You probably stayed in bed, you called in, you didn't do your usual activities. So some of the privileges, I guess, that go along with being sick, if we could call them those, the normal social roles and duties are excused. And Talcott Parsons was one of the first anthropologists to discuss that this is socially acceptable. Work, childcare, household, you don't have to do that anymore. But there's a catch, because there's a timestamp on that, isn't there? And you know when that timestamp is over and people start going, well, what happened to her? She's been sick for a week now. Isn't she done yet? Let's go. You know, and so there's time measured. And what are some of the requirements, though? A sick person should do all they can to get well. A sick person should seek help. Personal effort is required, and you're supposed to demonstrate that effort. And this becomes a point of biomedical ethical concern in cases such as, I've had some sad and unfortunate situations with multiple sclerosis at a stage where patients have just chosen to accept the course of disease process and choose to not treat. And the medical and social realms sometimes really battle that, don't like that. Another aspect is that a person who is sick should seek to cooperate. You ever get that sense? You really are supposed to cooperate. You're supposed to get up on that table in a little paper napkin and do what they tell you. And this is a whole structure that's built around medicine that requires compliance. We have gotten away from the word compliance and we are now using the word adherence because it's a nicer sounding word, but it means the same thing. Patients are supposed to be compliant with their home exercise program. How many of you have had a home exercise program? And I'm not saying that these things are bad. I'm pointing out that what Arthur Kleinman indicates is that patients, in particular with a chronic condition that does not go away, you've been there a week and it's still with you. Again, we know we're not sick in this room, but there are frameworks societally that still apply. We're supposed to educate ourselves. We're supposed to try. We're supposed to do the right thing. And it was just brought to my attention, too, that in some cases when you attempt to provide an explanation of, I have a voice disorder, and you might hear some voice breaks, but I'm okay with it, and let's just move through them, well, maybe you shouldn't talk. Okay, so that's that avoidance of the activity part. Maybe you should just rest. It'd be okay, just rest. So society has their own ideas of what it is that we're supposed to do. And when you feel that double bind of I'm supposed to be really active, but I'm supposed to be compliant, that's the double bind that many people with chronic conditions face. You want to be active, you want to be out there, you want to participate, and yet there's a whole list of things, and I think in particular with voice, when I treat voice patients, it's invasive into almost every decision you make throughout your entire day. From, do I eat the mint that's on this table here, because I've got reflux and that's going to cause me laryngopharyngeal penetration potentially? Should I take more water? Am I hydrated enough? Don't clear your throat. All those things that impact throughout the course of the day. Because this is invisible, otherwise invisible, many people don't appreciate the significant psychological distress and ramifications of feeling in the sick role and yet not really being able to be sick. Let me make sure I covered what was on this. So we assume a passive and a waiting stance. And one of the other things that is supposed to happen societally is that we're supposed to receive support emotionally and physically. Here again lies a specific issue with things that are chronic. Anybody ever experienced the concept that your family gets tired of providing physical and emotional support sometimes? There's family caregiver burnout of, I'm just tired of thinking about this. I've given you my support, I'm done with this, and patients sometimes report to me that they just feel like they don't want to talk about it anymore with their otherwise very supportive family because they're afraid to wear them out. And because this is chronic, that's why there's a real need for support groups, I think, because people are concerned about wearing out their family members. So this is some more issues of this double bind that we seek to address. And I don't have a specific solution to it, but I think so often if we can understand what's going on in the world between the society's expectations of me and what I'm feeling, we can really alleviate a lot of the psychological distress that we feel as we navigate the medical system, as we try to come to some degree of peace with what it is we're dealing with. One other point on this slide is the prescribed health behaviors, and the hand washing brought that to me. We're supposed to, there's a specific set of things we're supposed to do. Some people have any suggestions of what it is you're supposed to do? Anybody have any absurd ones that were told to them? What are you supposed to do when you have SDU? Or voice disorders in general? One was mentioned, vocal rest. Oh, just rest. Okay. So there's a set of prescriptions. And very important point about that, what if I decide I don't want to do vocal hygiene and I decide I don't want to pursue care and I decide I don't want to do some of these things? what then happens is patients feel a culpability shift. And no longer is it the SD that's at stake or at issue, but it is then the patient response. So if we do not choose to follow in this prescribed set of socially expected regimen of behaviors that I have to do when I am in this role, now I become culpable. In our culture, do we not have a lot of sense of prevention? We're trying to prevent everything, and we're trying to address things from a public health standpoint, where there's a huge push towards saying diet should be healthy, cardiovascular health diet, exercise, get enough sleep. There's a lot of things that we're supposed to do, recycle, I mean, there's a lot of things that we're supposed to do every day. So watch out for blame shifting, and that's another concept that I really like to share with patients, that yes, you can do everything right, and you're still going to have breaks in your voice. That's not your fault. That's not your fault. So what are some options with how can we approach this topic of SD in any diagnosis? There are three essentially, and it's in the outline of the talk, there's three broad approaches to how we might conceive of a given diagnosis with respect to our own identity. One of the approaches is the battle. I'm battling SD, I'm battling heart disease, I'm battling cancer, I'm battling MS. It's all over the place. And when someone ceases to walk this earth, we talk about them, they've lost their fight, or they lost their battle with whatever. And for some reason, our society just loves this, this metaphor. I think it potentially is very empowering. But there's just a few of them. We got boxing gloves with broccoli, so we've incorporated battling with some of those prescribed health behaviors that we're supposed to engage in. And we're supposed to do a good job of battling and fighting. That's one of the social narratives out there. We talk about survivorship, and I've survived this or that. The other part of the battle approach to any diagnosis, if you choose to take a battle approach, and it can be very constructive, it is very strongly a part of group affiliation. So very rarely do you battle alone, and that can be a very positive way of looking at this. That's why we're together today, because you're gaining strength to go out into the world and still participate knowing that you're part of a group that's also, so to speak, battling. So it reinforces our need for social support. We have a realistic view of conditions, or we lack rather a realistic view of conditions sometimes though, because we're always triumphant in some of these images that we see, the live strong image, triumphant. But we're not always so triumphant. And so again, the battle metaphor can inadvertently cause us to feel blame again. If I didn't quite successfully battle, I had a really bad day of voice breaks and I've been battling, but I lost. So with a chronic condition, we want to be really cautious about battle metaphors and even just recognize that the battle metaphor has pretty much seeped into the national psyche altogether because it's so prolific. It's very ubiquitous. Another way of looking at any diagnosis is the concept of blended. And this is where I'm seeing this, the concept that I am this diagnosis, and I really incorporate my, almost like a watercolor painting. I blend blue and red and create purple, and I am SD, or I am. And it removes potentially a sense of stigma, but their dominant identity of this person becomes equated with that disease category. And you've probably run into people like this that in any disease category that they champion the cause of whatever their diagnosis is. They didn't always have this diagnosis. I had a wonderful opportunity to meet with a young man named Avi Golden on Monday, who has a stroke, has aphasia, and he has championed the cause of aphasia, and he is becoming sort of the face of aphasia, and is delighted to do that, but it's definitely I am this disorder or this disease category, and it defines everything about behavior and decision making. Remember, identity is not only, it's who I am and where I've come from and where I'm going next. So it defines everything. There's another option, and I'm calling it I am with. So I'm not equated with the diagnosis, but I am with it. It's still separate from me, but it's definitely with me, and it's with me in an annoying, nagging, everyday kind of way. All right? And the metaphor I like to bring to this one, I have to credit Dr. Paul Cook, a mentor of mine at Michigan State, who has a lifelong communication disorder himself, and brought this analogy to me, and I found it so helpful I share it with other patients as well. In any given communication disorder, whether it's speech, voice, language, or cognitive, our objective ultimately, whether we're injecting Botox or whether we're doing any other procedure or therapeutic technique, our objective for our patients is to allow that disease, disorder, condition to move from being the hub of that wheel to just being another spoke in the wheel. In other words, it's still going to be part of my wheel, but it's not necessarily going to direct where I go. I'm not going to not go to that job interview because, and my goal ultimately is for all of my patients to never ever make a decision about their life on the basis of their condition. It's a neutral stance. So, yep, it's with me. It's with me all the time. It's part of the wheel. I can't go anywhere without it. But it does recognize some strengths. So I have other spokes in my wheel. I have a lot of really good spokes in my wheel. This one I'm not so crazy about, but it's there. And it definitely does not determine my behavior. And I do really appreciate this model of I am with. But the point I want to make with you today is not that you should take one model or the other. There may be times when you need to take a battle metaphor for yourself, and you need to just do battle. There are other times when you need to take a blended approach, and blending your identity right in with SD is what's right for you at that moment. I think the important message is that you have options of how you're going to do this. And you now hopefully have a bit of a framework to work from. Framework of chronicity and sick role, and a framework that says, here's some options. And they can change over your lifetime. So this is a schematic that kind of shows the core root ideas here really stem from critical contextualization theory from anthropology. And it's a way that we can deal with new information that comes into our lives that we weren't expecting and that really kind of shakes our assumption set. So we use this in public health to kind of help people incorporate new ideas. So I'm going to start on the top. The bottom left represents the physician. This is the diagnostic process. The green box, I now have a diagnosis, and now my patient response. I have three options. The top one is I fight. I fight SD. And that one is termed a non-contextualization. In other words, I'm going to do battle. I'm not going to contextualize it in any way into my life. It's an opponent. And what results in that oftentimes, in the top box says temporary relief. It might give us some temporary relief, right? Because we sometimes succeed in battle. But typically, oftentimes when we use that metaphor and that model, our symptoms just go underground and they lie in wait for a more fatigued or stressed out day, for the Botox to wear off, or whatever, and it's back. Moving to the very bottom, the I am, we would consider that to be uncritical contextualization. We just take it all in and accept it all in and incorporate it. And what happens oftentimes in that model, if we're not careful, the sick role can just be perpetuated. So I stay in the place of sickness, illness, disability, or what have you, because I have so incorporated this diagnosis into my psyche and persona, my public image as well, that I remain in that role of sick. And I think we all know people who have chosen to do that, who really tout that, and that's their first line. You get to know them after the first three questions, and the next statement they give you is what they have. So in the middle, I am with critical contextualization. Critical, what do I mean by critical? That means I'm taking a stance of there's some things about this that are affecting me deeply, and I don't like them. And there's some things about this that really don't affect me. I can still go for a run and do my triathlon and have, you fill in the blank. I can still participate in a lot of things that don't affect me. And we go about that with a 4-step process. We recognize the constants. SD has some constant features. And Dr. Bastian gave us a wonderful description of the phenomenology or how it looks. We learn about new aspects of it. We conceptualize a form that incorporates both things that I had in my life before and this new diagnosis. And then we create a new contextualized way of being with that SD. So it takes the good and the bad and it critically weighs them both. Going back to rehab world here, this picture on the left is really depicting in rehab medicine the fact that we are moving. Sometimes it feels slowly, sometimes I get excited and it seems like we're moving quickly, but we are working to move the rehab world into a participation model of rehabilitation. So that especially in the case where we have a chronic condition, where you all are waiting patiently for these wonderful scientific projects to move forward and to see some greater clarity on etiology and greater clarity on real cure. But while we wait, my desire is that we learn to participate and to cast the diagnosis into a usable forward-moving flow. So we address the health condition itself in the upper blue box. That's the therapies, the medications, all of the treatments. But we also seek to increase participation in life. And in the bottom, we might even environmentally address family members, talk about changes to the environment that we want to make. We might decrease the distance between a teacher and student. We might educate people in your office or in your world, in your sphere of influence. Are there people that we could teach that would help to alleviate some of your psychological distress? And so addressing things from a whole system perspective, not just your body, but your social network, the people in your environment. And also increasing your participation in all of these meaningful social contexts. That is really the model going forward, and it includes voice. It includes the voice. So with my patients, when I see them, I do ask family members to come in, and we do talk about all these aspects in addition to using some techniques. So from hub to spoke is where I would desire to move, and being intentional about it, intentionality that keeps moving forward. Not that battle is wrong, not that blending is wrong, both can be needed. But over the course of our lives, allowing this to just be a spoke would be one concept I would love for you to take away from today. Renegotiating concepts. Here's some summary of some of the concepts we're going to summarize and wrap up here and give you a chance to do a little bit of homework. Challenges with SD is that it continues to change. Negotiation of my who is an ongoing process. The validation and affirmation of my who does not rest solely on the changes in my speech and voice. And the renegotiation of my identity relies on a consistent interaction and dialogue and reciprocal affirmation from other people. So I have to keep talking, I have to keep interacting. And that renegotiation relies on these social channels and participating with life. So this is a little bit of homework for us now. I've put several circles of closeness here. I have a relationship with myself in my own mind. I reason, and that's the first column here. And I also have a close sort of friends. Let's see if I can get that. Close circles would be friends and close family. And then I have wider circles, And I have 3 different maybe approaches or models to use. So by myself, I've heard one individual said, when I'm by myself, I don't have spasmodic dysphonia. Makes sense, right? I hear my voice in my head and it's all fine. So I don't need any models when I'm by myself. When I'm talking to the dog, it's all good. How about when so sometimes by myself, perhaps it's blended. I put that in parentheses. What kind of model do I use in my closed circles? A lot of times people in their closed circles, this is just an example for you, they use the model of beside. Okay, and they're feeling at liberty to allow it to be beside, but it depends on the person. In wider circles, most often, people really feel the push to see that they're using the battle model, and that they're comfortable in narrating that and using that publicly. A lot of people do use a blended model publicly as well. So I want you to basically take some time to consider what models have you used to incorporate this new, or perhaps old, diagnosis into your life? How do you take it in? How do you view it? And has that changed, perhaps? So that's one bit of homework. And for some people, they really change their approach according to the context. The other homework that I have for you, and I actually do have my patients do this as well, because we spend a lot of time working on the voice, doing all these treatments, and I actually want people to recognize what their spokes are in their life. And try to figure out, for you, is SD in the middle right now? And is that okay with me? Or is SD a spoke, and is that okay with me? You might have it be in the hub and be okay with that because you're in advocacy work and you really want to continue that way. But there are a lot of spokes though in your life, and so I have my patients actually list out what do those mean. Those usually are your life roles. I'm a mom. I'm a daughter. I'm a runner. What are your interests? And often those roles relate to what we do. And that participation in life, in turn, relates to the reconstruction of our identity. And so my identity is no longer resting singularly in SD, even though it does occupy a lot of my time and even a lot of my thought process. And that indeed may be true. But I really like my patients to fill the spokes sheet out and just once in a while remind themselves of the social history that they bring with them wherever they go. And even if you are in advocacy work, to go ahead and recognize that this is not all of you, and consciously kind of go about this process of recognition of that whole wheel as a way to move forward. So that is the homework I'm leaving you with. And I thought what I would do is, I don't know how much time we have, if any. We have maybe a couple minutes to hear from you. Thoughts about sick roll, first of all. Anybody experienced disconnect with regard to something that you know you're not sick from, but yet there's societal expectations for how I'm supposed to do this? Comments about that or questions in general? Yeah.
I think the issue with SD is that it's, it's a chronic condition, but it's public. Once you start talking to somebody, they know you have, there's something different about you. And other things, I was talking to a friend a while ago, and she has some kind of gastrointestinal, pretty serious things going on, and I thought, nobody knows she has that unless she tells people she has that. Where with SD, once you start talking, and I'm a teacher, and kids last year, I think they're used to my voice now, but they would say, why do you talk like that? And right now my voice is fairly normal. I'm right between my Botox treatments. So, but then, at the tail end of that, my voice is a little bit more sketchy. So, so it's out there. And I think that's one of the big differences with dealing with SD.
Yeah, so it's definitely audible, and as soon as you start trying to express yourself, and that's the conduit in which we affirm ourselves and construct identity, and that's point very well taken. As soon as you open your mouth, you are trying to do that in a sense, but through a conduit that doesn't sound the same. Yeah. Yeah, Wendy.
I think one of the biggest things for me when I was first diagnosed and living with it prior to any kind of treatment was I had a friend who I was trying to explain to her that I was grieving a loss, and it was a really big deal for me, and I couldn't get out of bed. I was so despondent, so distressed, and so depressed. She's like, I don't understand. How is this a loss? Like, she just totally did not get it. I didn't have cancer. I wasn't dying from some terminal illness. So how could I be experiencing grief? It's just a voice.
Oh, right.
That's a really good point. And it doesn't have the drama of cancer. It doesn't have the drama of a lot of things, and yet it's very invasive to every part of our lives.
I think one of the things that's the hardest for me is quick conversation. So book club, something like that. I think maybe we just have to say to people, it's just going to take me a minute, to get started. Or you raise your hand and people are waiting and you can't quite get it out. So we might need to make some accommodations in letting other people know.
Agreed. I think that time pressure, and that's one of the reasons that in both fluency as well as in SD, saying your name in an introduction is one of the most challenging things, because it's, hi, my name is, and there's a couple seconds and it's got to come, and that pressure that mounts up only exacerbates the issue. But that's one of the most high pressure speaking jobs people can do, is just their own name.
And sometimes I actually had a boss that was probably the cruelest person I've ever met in my life, who would tell me to, can you talk softer? If I didn't project, I had no voice. And unfortunately, my job was talking. I ran meetings. I was on the phone all day. And when the man who signs your check is that cruel, it's like, how do you you're in a battle situation and you don't even want to be there. I am not SD. I have SD. It's two different things. But when it's somebody's around you and that's kind of forced on you, I don't know how to deal with that. Fortunately, I was able to retire, so I really wish you one.
I'm going to close. I really appreciate your engagement and your thoughtful questions, and I hope that the frameworks are at least a place to begin. It certainly doesn't give all the answers at all by any means, but hopefully helps you to frame some of the broader themes in medical anthropology that are focused on. And I see a hand up, so.
Yeah, can I just say two quick things? I obviously don't have SD, I'm a clinician.
Sure.
And one.
Use the mic.
Okay. I just wanted Tia to walk across the room. Two things that struck me during the talk is one, diseases like cancer, heart disease, things like that, primarily affect the individual. I mean, and caregivers and your diagnosticians. SD also affects the listener, like you were saying with your boss. So as when I work with my patients who have SD, we also talk a lot about how this is affecting the listener, and it places an additional burden on them. And there is maybe a counseling role that the person with SD can take on in educating a listener. Like you said in book club, hold on a minute, it'll take me a second. And just, there's that piece of it there that I think is something that someone with SD can adopt and be a little helpful. And yeah. And my other thought is, there are many Facebook groups about SD right now. And it's interesting, using your paradigm, how they've named themselves. One of them is called SD Survivors. So there's your battle model. And one of them is treatments and cures. And it would be interesting, I'd add to the homework, maybe if you're on Facebook and read those posts, to maybe see how those people are perceiving themselves when they're posting. Because some of them are total victims. This is being done to me. And some are just, hopeful, Dr. Burke is going to cure me. And, it's interesting to read those using your constructs.
And I think that a couple points you make that, addressing the speaker and listener environment, our work in neurogenic communication disorders is definitely moving towards, we really should be, even for voice disorders, addressing the needs of the family, working on environmental factors in all the speakers that you encounter. So those are an object of our intervention. So really good point, well taken.